Hey folks, welcome to another Passion for Sound audio review, and today a look at the Schiit Asgard 3. The Asgard 3 is a $199 headphone amplifier and preamplifier with the modular capability to take either a phono card or a DAC on board inside the amp itself. My time with the Asgard 3 has been a little bit of a journey, so let's get into the review and I'll tell you all about it. If you've seen my review of the Modius, you'll know that the Asgard 3 was kind of a throw-in when I bought the Modius on eBay. One of the patrons of the channel pointed out the Asgard 3 and Modius for sale, but realistically I was buying it mostly for the Modius, and the Asgard 3 was kind of a throw-in. And that began a bit of a journey with the Asgard 3 for me, as it joined in amongst my recent reviews of the Magnius, the Heresy, the Modius and the Bifrost 2, as well as my interview with Jason Stoddard from Schiit. My starting impressions or expectations of the Asgard 3 were that it was a basic amplifier, maybe a bit warm and thick and not much chop. That's partly because I came from the quite analytical and detail-oriented Magnius, and also because in my conversations with Jason, he spoke about preferring those warmer, thicker sounding amplifiers. So in my head, I had a bit of an expectation coming into the Asgard 3, and I don't think it did it justice initially. As time's gone by, my respect for the Asgard 3 has grown dramatically as I've put it up against some other outstanding amps that sit at a similar price point. I'll talk through some comparisons specifically with those, including the Topping L30, the Schiit Magnius, and the Burson Fun, to help describe why I've gone from thinking the Asgard 3 is just another amp to actually thinking it's a really fantastic offering, particularly at the price. In fact, at this point, my overall opinion of Schiit has improved significantly because of the Asgard 3 and what it's able to do at the price it's able to do it. But I'll talk about that a bit more when I talk about the competition and why the Asgard 3 is so special. So coming back around now, let's talk a bit about the specifications, the price, etc. What makes the Asgard 3 what it is. So it's a $199 amplifier, as I mentioned before, and that equates to around about $240, $250 Australian dollars, not including any shipping. I know some people have an issue with the prices that Schiit charge for shipping, but as I'm going to talk about shortly, I actually don't think it's so bad when you put this in the context of how it performs versus other similarly priced equipment. In terms of the design, the Asgard 3 is a mid-sized product in Schiit terms, so it has the normal chassis design of the simple metal casing with a beautiful wrapped aluminium front and top. On the front of the amplifier, as always with Schiit products, it's very simple. We've got volume control, we've got gain switch, and we've got input switch. Now the input switch allows you to choose to use the analog inputs, which I'll show you in a moment, or to use whatever the onboard card is. As I said before, this can take a phono stage card or a DAC card. So switching this switch will tell it whether you want to use the phono stage or the internal DAC, or just use the incoming RCAs. Finally, we've got a 6.3mm headphone jack, so this is a pure single-ended amplifier. There's no balanced amplification here, it's single-ended all the way. Don't let that worry you though. If you're used to needing balance for extra power, the Asgard 3 has plenty. It'll output 3.5 watts to a 32 ohm load and still nearly a full watt all the way up into your 300 ohm headphones. So it's got plenty of power, and as I'll talk about a bit later, it's driven every single thing I've tried it with no problems at all, including IEMs. Speaking of IEMs, let's talk briefly about this volume control. First and foremost, it looks good and it feels good to turn, but most importantly, there's excellent channel balance all the way from about the 7 o'clock position. I found myself listening to IEMs at about the 9 o'clock position. So there's a decent amount of range between that 7 o'clock position and 9 o'clock position where you can get good adjustment of your volume even at slightly lower listening levels. Having covered off the front though, let's jump around and take a look at the back. So on the back of the amplifier, as always with Schiit products, and this was a conversation I had with Jason during my interview with him, we've got the power switch, we've also got the input for the power, and then we've got RCA outs and RCA ins. One other thing you might notice is we've also got this panel here, which is where the modular cards will sit. So that's either going to house a pair of RCA inputs from a phono source, or it's going to have a USB socket for the internal DAC. While we're on the back and talking about inputs and outputs, these preamp RCA outputs here are variable with the volume control, and they do mute with the front headphone socket. So this is a really handy little device if you want to have a pair of active speakers and headphone use without spending a fortune. Now I'd love to tell you how the phono stage sounds or how the internal DAC sounds for the Asgard 3, but I can't comment on those because I bought this secondhand from eBay and therefore it comes as it comes. So for anyone looking for more information on the phono stage or the DAC stage available for the Asgard 3, I'm afraid you will have to look elsewhere. Flipping the amp back around though, let's start talking about the sound. As I mentioned at the beginning, my expectations of the Asgard 3 were probably a bit skewed to start with. Firstly, I'd chatted about it a little bit with Jason and he'd mentioned that he likes it as a thicker, warmer, more fun sounding amplifier, and that immediately led me to think it wasn't going to be as good at detail retrieval as something like the Magnius that I'd reviewed recently as well. What I found when I started listening to the Asgard 3 is that yes, it's definitely a thicker, warmer leaning amplifier, but it's not as slow or as lacking in resolution as that description might lead you to believe. It's not super transparent or overly analytical, but it's also no slouch when it comes to detail retrieval and layering of the sound. I'd actually describe the Asgard 3 as only a slight touch warmer than maybe true neutral. If I listen to it next to something like the TT2, obviously in a totally different ballpark, but in terms of transparent and uncoloured in the TT2 compared to the Asgard 3, there's no doubt the sound is a little bit thicker and a little bit fuller, but it's not dramatic. It's not like going to something like the Denafrips Artemis that I've recently reviewed, which is absolutely unashamedly a coloured, rich and lush sounding amplifier. That's not what the Asgard 3 is. The Asgard 3 just has a touch more body than a truly neutral or analytical amplifier would. Before I provide some comparisons though, I want to talk about what makes the Asgard 3 both excellent value, but also a better amplifier than you might think when someone starts talking about it as being rich, warm and fun. The Asgard 3 uses a fully discrete circuit design. What that means is that the sound amplification is handled by individual components, so transistors, resistors, capacitors, etc., rather than being handled by a chip, like Schiit's own Magnius does, like the Heresy does, like the Topping L30 does. In my years listening to various amplifiers, I've always found that a discrete design tends to sound better than an equivalently priced chip design. As I've mentioned before on the channel, I'm still on a bit of a journey to fully understand why that is, but the outcome of a discrete design tends to be a better sense of layering and depth in the soundstage and an overall more organic sound. And for me, that's where the Asgard 3 excels. The sound coming from the Asgard 3, whilst not maybe a high-end quality sound like you get from a $1,000, $2,000 amplifier, it's exceptionally good for the price in terms of its three-dimensionality, its layering, and its trueness to life. This is an amplifier that makes me forget that I'm listening to a recording and instead just enjoy the music. Whereas something like the Magnius, which I'll talk about more in a moment, provides a bit of a wall of sound and overwhelms a little bit with detail, but therefore sounds like a recording of the music, not the live thing itself. If you think about yourself sitting at a live venue, you're generally going to be able to hear the sense of where the lead singer is placed, where the drums are placed, where the bass is placed, and they're all at slightly different positions in the soundstage. Discrete designs like the Asgard 3 tend to produce that same sense of depth and reality better than the chip-based amplifiers that tend to put it all on one plane. So with all that in mind, let's talk a bit about how the Asgard 3 and its discrete design stacks up against a couple of competitors with integrated designs using chips. The first comparison I tried was with Schiit's own competitor to the Asgard 3 in the Schiit Magnius. The Magnius is also $199 US, but it's a fully balanced design. For this test, I mostly used the Magnius in its balanced setup with balanced in and balanced out versus the Asgard 3 fully single-ended, of course. What I found was the Magnius is probably a touch more resolving, but it's also a lot drier sounding and a lot less three-dimensional. As I've already said, the Magnius produces a flat wall of sound with lots of detail, whereas the Asgard 3 has a bit more nuance and a bit more depth to the sound. Interestingly, when I tried the Magnius using the single-ended output, the difference was much smaller, and in fact the Asgard 3 was clearly better. The overall tonality and characteristics of the sound between the two were very similar, but the Magnius lost out because all of the sound was more compressed, there was less space between the sounds, and there definitely wasn't any sense of three-dimensionality like there is on the Asgard 3. Ultimately, to me, as I kept listening back and forth between the two, in almost all cases, I preferred the sound of the Asgard 3. It was just more lifelike, more realistic, and more enjoyable. Those of you looking for absolute resolution will probably still prefer the Magnius with the way it presents the sound, but I don't necessarily believe it's providing more resolution so much as just pushing the details forward more. And that's going to be preferable to some, but not necessarily to everybody. The other amplifier I tried in this comparison was the Topping L30. I raved about the Topping L30 when I got it for review, and I still think it's a fantastic amplifier at $140 US. So I was really interested to hear how it stacked up against something costing just $60 US more and offering a fully discrete design compared to the L30's integrated chip design. Once again, the differences were very similar between the L30 and the Asgard 3 as they were to the Magnius and the Asgard 3. But overall, the Asgard 3 was comfortably better. It separates sounds better, the three-dimensionality is better, and little things like texture and bass weight were better on the Asgard 3 overall. It's not to say the L30 is not still an excellent amplifier, but the Asgard 3 was clearly worth the $60 US more in my opinion. Whereas the Magnius probably still had an edge in resolution, or at least perceived resolution, I didn't feel like the L30 could say the same. For me, the L30 was slightly more congested sounding compared to the Asgard 3 and therefore lost out on the sense of resolution. My final comparison in this test was using the Burson Fun with a couple of V6 Vivids installed. That setup costs $245 US, so it's about $50 US more than the Asgard 3. What I found in that comparison was that things were much more similar now because they're both discrete designs. The presentation from the Fun with the V6 Vivids was a little bit more energetic and a little bit more resolving, and for some people it's going to be preferable. The other thing, of course, with the Fun is you can always swap the op amps to tune it. If you do like your sound a little bit thicker, you can use the V6 Classics, or you can go outside the Burson world and try any op amp you like. Sticking to the V6 Vivids as kind of the reference standard for the Burson products, I found that the sound was a bit drier from the Fun and a little bit more resolved, as I've already said, whereas the Asgard 3 was a bit more mid-focused and therefore had a bit more of an intimate sound to it. It wasn't closed in or congested, but they just had slightly different presentations based on the little bit of extra treble information from the Fun and the little bit more mid-range focus that came through from the Asgard 3. Ultimately, I probably lean slightly towards the slightly warmer approach of the Asgard 3, but both are fantastic sound and a lot of it will depend on the headphones used. With that in mind, I tried a quick test with a range of headphones. I was really interested to see which headphones I preferred with which amplifiers. For this test, I was comparing the L30, the Magnius, and the Asgard 3 here. Interestingly, as I conducted these tests, what I found was that the differences were more pronounced for me with the dynamic driver headphones than they were with planars. With planars, I tended to go either way and all of them sounded quite good, whereas with the dynamics, it was more of a clear-cut decision. I started off with the HD800S and I comfortably preferred the Asgard 3 because the HD800S benefits from that little bit of extra warmth that comes from the Asgard 3's presentation. It also allows you to really benefit from the HD800S soundstage presentation, where you get that amazing width and depth that the Asgard 3 can actually do justice to. In the case of the chip-based amplifiers, they tend to flatten that soundstage and therefore you lose a bit of the depth in the HD800S even though you still retain the width. Moving on to the Mesa Empyreans, I would comfortably use any of these three amps to drive those headphones. I probably slightly preferred the Asgard 3, but it wasn't as clear-cut as the HD800S. So I moved on to my next test, which was the DT880 250 ohm, the special edition black version that I reviewed recently on the channel. Once again, I went straight to the Asgard 3 as my preference after listening to all three of them. The sound was smoother, it was more engaging and more realistic. Part of that's because the DT880 is a fairly bright headphone and benefits from the extra weight and thickness of sound in the Asgard 3, but I think it also comes down to the overall benefits of the discrete design of the Asgard 3 and perhaps the way dynamic drivers are able to represent that information. From there I flipped to the Sundaras from Headphone, and on this occasion I actually preferred the Magnius. Interestingly, I was using the Magnius in a single-ended setup because that was the cable I had connected to the Sundaras. So even though some people have knocked the Magnius as single-ended output, I did prefer it for whatever reason to the Asgard 3 in this particular test. My initial guess is it's that slight increase in dryness and sense of resolution from the Magnius that suited the Sundara's sound and therefore gave it a slight edge for me over the Asgard 3. My final test took me back to the focal clears, back to a dynamic headphone, and in this occasion the Asgard 3 won again. The sound was just warmer, smoother, and overall better separated across the board. What's interesting to me is that after each of these tests with different headphones, not one of them had me preferring the L30, despite it being a very good amplifier. Probably more interesting though was the fact that the Asgard 3 was clearly my preference across the board on all but one test, and on that test the Magnius and the Asgard 3 were only a hair apart in terms of my preference. So ultimately what all this says to me is that the Asgard 3 has gone from being an amplifier that I figured was okay, probably a little bit thick, a little bit warm, not particularly resolving. It's gone from that expectation to actually proving itself as preferable to me over the Topping L30 and the Schiit Magnius. It doesn't quite have the initial sense of resolution, and it is a slightly warmer, thicker amplifier, but the layering, the three-dimensionality, and in fact the resolution that is available once you get past your initial impressions of it compared to something like a Magnius or an L30 means that it's actually an excellent amplifier. I had intended to relist the Asgard 3 on eBay and keep the L30 as my go-to budget amp, but I can tell you now the Asgard 3 is going nowhere. It's going to become my new reference for what a budget amp should sound like. The Burson Fun, as I mentioned earlier, is also excellent, but the fact that the Asgard 3 looks better and to me has a slightly preferable tonality without tweaking it using op amps means the Asgard 3 will get the win for my day-to-day use as a budget amp and preamplifier. This whole process has just reaffirmed for me that if you can get a discrete design amp over an integrated amp at about the same price, you'll almost always get better sound quality. Of course, if you've got a particularly thick sounding headphone, the Asgard 3 may not be a great choice for you, but on almost every other headphone you can think of, the Asgard 3 is a real winner and I highly recommend it. If you found this review useful and helpful, as always, I'd love it if you'd hit the subscribe button and the like button, and maybe even tell some people about it. It helps grow the channel and helps me bring more reviews to you. For now though, I'll leave you to the music, so happy listening, and I'll see you here next time on Passion for Sound.